This is the testimony of Elizabeth Holmes going on the record in San Francisco, California at 9 o'clock a.m. on July 11th, 2017.
She dropped out of Stanford at 19 to change medicine forever. By 30, she was worth $9 billion on paper. She was on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, and T magazine. She gave TED Talks. She sat on prestigious boards. Henry Kissinger was her advisor. George Shultz was her advisor. James Mattis was her advisor. Rupert Murdoch invested. The Walton family invested. Larry Ellison invested. And the product she was selling, a revolutionary blood testing device that could diagnose 200 diseases from a single drop of blood, did not work. Not almost worked. Not worked sometimes. Did not work. This is the story of Theranos. And it is the story of how one of the most sophisticated investor networks in human history got fooled for over a decade by something that was, at its core, medically impossible. Elizabeth Holmes enrolled at Stanford's chemical engineering program in 2002. She was 19. Within a year, she had dropped out, convinced she had an idea that would change healthcare forever. The idea was superficially compelling. Blood testing, she argued, was broken. Traditional labs required large vials of blood, took days to return results, and cost patients significant amounts of money. What if you could take a single drop from a fingertip, run it through a small proprietary device, and get results for hundreds of tests within hours? If that worked, it would genuinely be revolutionary. Faster diagnosis, earlier intervention, lower cost. Holmes could articulate the vision with extraordinary clarity and passion. She founded Theranos in 2003, the name combining therapy and diagnosis. She was 19 years old. From the very beginning, Holmes constructed a persona with extraordinary deliberateness. She wore black turtlenecks, a conscious echo of Steve Jobs, whose biography she reportedly read obsessively. She lowered her natural voice to a deep baritone she maintained in virtually every public appearance. She maintained an unblinking, intense eye contact that people consistently described as either magnetic or unsettling, depending on how charitable they were feeling. She told the same stories repeatedly with minor variations. Her fear of needles as the emotional origin of Theranos, her father's health struggles, her dead uncle, whose cancer she believed might have been caught earlier with better blood testing. Whether or not these stories were true in every detail, they served a specific purpose. They made the technology feel personal and urgent, rather than corporate and clinical. And they made Elizabeth Holmes feel like a visionary rather than a fraud. From the earliest days, Theranos operated under extreme secrecy. Employees signed non-disclosure agreements that were, by multiple accounts, more aggressive than anything typical in Silicon Valley. Teams were siloed from each other. Engineers working on one aspect of the Edison device, Theranos' proprietary testing machine, often had no idea what teams in adjacent rooms were building. Holmes justified this as protection against competitors. In retrospect, it also protected the company from internal scrutiny. Nobody had the full picture. And the people who did start to assemble the full picture, who understood that the science wasn't working, were leaving. The Edison, Theranos' blood testing device, was supposed to run hundreds of tests from a single fingertip drop of blood using proprietary microfluidics technology. In reality, for the vast majority of tests, Theranos was using commercially available Siemens analyzers that had been modified to run on smaller sample sizes than their design intended. This modification created serious accuracy problems. Diluting samples to run them through machines not designed for those volumes introduced error rates that, in a medical testing context, were genuinely dangerous. A test that incorrectly tells a patient their blood glucose is normal when it isn't, or that their HIV test is negative when it isn't, causes real harm. This is the part of the Theranos story that matters most and gets covered least. Between roughly 2013 and 2016, Theranos ran tests for real patients through partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway. These were not wealthy Silicon Valley investors who could absorb a bad outcome. These were ordinary people relying on blood test results to make medical decisions. Patients received false positives, results suggesting serious conditions they didn't have, triggering unnecessary procedures and significant anxiety. Patients received false negatives, missing conditions they did have, delaying treatment. At least one patient reportedly received an HIV positive result that turned out to be incorrect. The full extent of patient harm has never been definitively established, but regulators and prosecutors concluded it was real and material. In October 2015, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou published a story that began unraveling everything. Carreyrou had been tipped off by former Theranos employees and had spent months verifying their accounts. His reporting revealed that Theranos was running most tests on commercial machines rather than its own technology. That accuracy was severely compromised, and that the company had misrepresented its capabilities to investors, partners, and regulators. Theranos' initial response was aggressive denial. Holmes went on CNBC and dismissed the reporting as inaccurate and motivated by competitors. Theranos' lawyers sent threatening letters. The company's board, loaded with establishment figures who had trusted Holmes, largely stood by her publicly, but the reporting was accurate. And once it was published, regulators began looking much more closely. Theranos' board and investor list reads like a roll call of American institutional power. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, William Perry, Riley Bechtel, Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, Larry Ellison. What almost none of them had in common was medical or scientific expertise. Theranos' board was stacked with political, military, and financial heavyweights who were exactly the wrong people to evaluate whether a blood testing device worked. They could evaluate whether Elizabeth Holmes was impressive. They could not evaluate whether her chemistry was sound. This is one of the most important structural failures in the whole story, not just of Theranos, but of how Silicon Valley applied its investment culture to a regulated medical industry. In tech, you can ship a product that's partially broken and fix it with software updates. In medical diagnostics, a partially broken product harms patients. The norms of one industry were catastrophically misapplied to the other. The most extraordinary detail in the Theranos story is how few of the investors and board members ever asked a qualified scientist to evaluate the technology. George Shultz's own grandson, Tyler Shultz, a Stanford-educated biologist who worked at Theranos, raised serious concerns internally and then became one of Carreyrou's sources. His grandfather sided with Holmes over his own grandson for years. Venture capital, firms that pride themselves on rigorous due diligence, passed on Theranos, not because they saw through it, but because Holmes refused to show them the technology in enough detail to evaluate it. The investors who did put money in were largely operating on social proof and Holmes's personal charisma rather than scientific verification. Holmes understood something important about how trust works in elite networks. If the right people believe something, the next tier of people will believe it because the right people believe it without independently verifying the underlying claim. She didn't need to prove her technology worked. She needed to get enough credible names attached to it that everyone else assumed someone else had already done the verification. Ramesh Balwani, known as Sunny, was Holmes's partner, both romantically and operationally. As president and COO of Theranos, he ran day-to-day operations and was, by multiple accounts, a source of significant fear within the company. Employees described a culture of intimidation, sudden firings, and an atmosphere where raising technical concerns was professionally dangerous. The relationship between Holmes and Balwani was later central to Holmes's legal defense. She claimed he had exerted coercive control over her during the period of the fraud, a claim that divided observers and the jury in complex ways. Following Carreyrou's reporting, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted an inspection of Theranos' Newark, California laboratory. Their findings were damning. In July 2016, CMS revoked Theranos' laboratory certification, banned Holmes from operating labs for 2 years, and ultimately shut down the Newark facility. Theranos voided tens of thousands of test results. The company that had claimed to run accurate tests on hundreds of conditions was now telling patients that every result they had ever received might be unreliable. In June 2018, federal prosecutors indicted both Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors and against patients. Holmes's trial began in 2021. The jury found her guilty on 4 counts, 3 counts of defrauding investors and 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud against investors. She was acquitted on charges relating to defrauding patients, a verdict that frustrated many observers who felt the patient harm was the most morally serious aspect of the case. In November 2022, Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to a minimum security facility in Bryan, Texas, in May 2023. Sunny Balwani was convicted on all 12 counts against him and sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. Lesson 1. Social proof is not due diligence. The most sophisticated investors in the world put money into Theranos based largely on who else had put money in and who was on the board. Not one of them independently verified that the technology worked. In a normal tech investment, that might be an acceptable risk. In a medical diagnostics company, it was a failure of basic responsibility. Lesson 2. Secrecy that protects against competitors also protects against accountability. Every layer of NDA and compartmentalization that Holmes built to protect Theranos from competitors also made it impossible for the people who knew the science wasn't working to tell anyone who mattered. If your company's secrecy prevents employees from raising safety concerns, the secrecy is not protecting you. It is protecting the fraud. Lesson 3. Charisma is not competence, and in regulated industries, the difference is life and death. Elizabeth Holmes was genuinely exceptional at performing certainty, conviction, and vision. Those qualities are valuable in a founder. They are not a substitute for a product that works. In consumer tech, shipping a flawed product means bad reviews. In medical diagnostics, it means patients making life decisions on false information. John Kerry Rue, the Wall Street Journal reporter whose investigation broke the story, published a book called Bad Blood in 2018 that remains the definitive account of Theranos. If this story interested you, that book is where to go next. Tyler Schultz, the whistleblower whose grandfather sat on Theranos' board, gave up a significant amount personally and professionally to do the right thing. He is worth remembering alongside Holmes as the other face of this story. Elizabeth Holmes spent years convincing the world she was the next Steve Jobs, the turtleneck, the voice, the vision, the reality distortion field. The difference is that Steve Jobs' products worked. Next week, we're looking at Wirecard, the German payments company that faked 1.9 billion euros, whose COO fled the country by private jet, and who investigators now believe was working for Russian intelligence the entire time. Subscribe so you don't miss it.